The
It hurts
coffee
so
pot weighed
much.
3 pounds.
Just hold
On
on.
a good
I'm
morning,
scared.
Darcy
I've
Whitmore
got you.
could carry
Trust
it
me.
one-handed, fill 6 cups in under a minute, never spill a drop. This was not a good morning. Her left hand was a ruined thing, swollen and purple from knuckle to wrist, the index and middle fingers bent at angles that made customers look away. She gripped the pot with her right hand, braced it against her hip, and poured. The stream wobbled. Coffee splashed across the saucer. She grabbed a napkin, wiped it clean, set the cup down and smiled. Tight, controlled. A performance rehearsed through so much pain, it had become automatic. The customer glanced at her face, then looked away fast, the way people look away from car accidents they'd rather not remember. Her left eye was swollen completely shut. The lid puffed and discolored dark purple, fading to sick yellow at the edges. Her lip was split down the center, crusted over with blood. She tried to hide under lipstick at 4:30 that morning, standing in a bathroom with no lock hands shaking, staring into a cracked mirror, and wondering how many more mornings like this she had left. Bruises circled her throat like a necklace made of violence. She'd worn a turtleneck to cover them, but the fabric had shifted during the breakfast rush. Now the marks were visible. Fingerprints. 4 on the left side of her neck, 1 thumb impression on the right. A perfect map of the hand that had squeezed until her vision went white and her legs stopped working, and she dropped to the kitchen floor like something discarded. Harlow's Diner sat on the corner of Main Street and 4th Avenue in Caldwell, Montana. Small town, population 4,800. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business and pretended they didn't when that business turned ugly. Caldwell had 1 traffic light, 2 churches, a hardware store that had been dying slow for 11 years, and a diner that served the best chicken fried steak within 60 miles. The town sat in a valley between 2 ridges of pine-covered mountains, pretty in the summer, brutal in the winter, and quiet with the particular quiet of a place hiding something. Darcy had worked at Harlow's for 3 months, 91 days. Every single one of those days she had shown up with fresh damage. Week 1, a black eye, she explained away as walking into a door. The regulars nodded. Nobody pressed. Week 3, a wrist so swollen she poured left-handed for 6 days. Merle the cook asked once. Darcy said she'd slipped on ice. There was no ice. It was August. Week 5, burns on her forearm, 3 of them round and deliberate, the diameter of a cigarette tip. She wore long sleeves in 80-degree heat, and nobody commented because commenting would have meant acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledging what was happening would have meant doing something about it, and doing something about it was not on anyone's agenda. Week 8, 2 cracked ribs that sent a bolt of white-hot pain through her torso every time she bent to clear a table or reach for a plate. She moved through her shift like a woman walking on broken glass, each step calculated to minimize the agony that radiated from her left side with every breath. Week 12, the worst yet, an eye swollen shut, a nose that might be broken, fingers clearly fractured, stomped on while she lay curled on the kitchen floor at midnight, trying to protect her skull while a man twice her size brought his boot down on her outstretched hand. Every customer at Harlow's Diner had witnessed the progression. Farmers who arrived at 5:30 for black coffee before heading out to their fields. Retirees who occupied the corner booth from 7 to 9, nursing decaf and arguing about the weather and the government and the price of diesel. Truckers passing through on Route 200 who stopped for pie and a bathroom break. Mothers with toddlers. Construction crews in paint-spattered boots. The mayor who ate a Western omelet every Wednesday at a table near the window. The pastor from First Methodist who preferred his eggs poached and his conversations shallow. They all saw. Her face was a canvas of violence refreshed weekly, and every single person in that diner read the painting and chose to hang it back on the wall without comment. Not our business. She probably did something to provoke it. That's what happens when a woman with no people shacks up with a man like Brennan Collier. She made her bed, let her lie in it. Caldwell had opinions about people who weren't from Caldwell. The town was insular, closed tight, the kind of place where isolation had bred suspicion, and suspicion had hardened it into culture. If your grandparents hadn't walked these streets, you were a visitor regardless of how long you stayed. An outsider, a guest whose welcome was conditional on your ability to cause no trouble, draw no attention, and accept whatever the town decided you deserved. Darcy Whitmore had arrived 10 months ago from somewhere back east. No family in Caldwell, no history, no roots, just a battered Honda Civic with a child seat in the back, a suitcase held shut with a bungee cord, and a look in her eyes like a woman who had been running so long She'd forgotten what standing still felt like. She'd rented a room above the laundromat on 6th Street for 2 months, worked a string of cash jobs, kept to herself, and spoken to almost nobody, except the woman at the grocery checkout and the man at the gas station who never made eye contact with anyone regardless of where they came from. She had come to Caldwell to disappear, to find a place small enough that nobody would look for her, where she could earn enough to feed her daughter and build some fragile version of safety in a world that had offered her very little of it. That plan had lasted about 2 months before she met Brennan Collier at the Sinclair station on Route 200, filling up her Civic while he leaned against a truck that cost more than most houses in town. Brennan was 38 years old, tall, lean, good-looking in a way that drew women's eyes and earned men's respect and hid everything underneath. He had money, cash that appeared in thick rolls and was spent without hesitation, a truck with custom rims and leather seats, clothes that were nicer than anything Caldwell's shops carried. The money came from nowhere legitimate, but Caldwell didn't ask questions about money because money was money, and Brennan spent his freely at local businesses, and business owners don't interrogate the hands that feed them. He was a drug dealer, mid-level. Methamphetamine, mostly some prescription pills, enough volume to generate serious income but not enough to attract serious federal interest. He moved product through Caldwell and 3 surrounding counties, using a network of runners and drop points that had operated smoothly for years, protected by monthly cash payments to Sheriff Wayne Loomis, who deposited the money into an account his wife didn't know about and looked the other direction with the practiced ease of a man who had decided long ago that corruption was just another form of budgeting. That first meeting at the Brown station led to a first date, dinner at the only restaurant in Caldwell that wasn't Harlow's, a place called The Range that served steaks and baked potatoes and closed at 9. Brennan opened doors, pulled out her chair, asked about her daughter with what seemed like genuine interest. He remembered details from their gas station conversation. Darcy's daughter's name? The fact that Darcy took her coffee black. The small things that people remember when they're paying attention or when they're collecting information, and the difference between those two activities isn't visible until it's too late. Their second date was a drive through the foothills east of town, windows cracked, early spring air coming through, smelling like pine and snowmelt. Brennan told her stories about his childhood, a father who drank, a mother who disappeared, years of poverty and loneliness. None of it was true. Every word was manufactured to create the illusion of shared damage, to make Darcy believe she'd found someone who understood her particular kind of broken. It worked. People who've been hurt recognize pain in others instinctively, and they trust that recognition even when the pain is counterfeit. By the third date, Darcy had allowed herself to believe that Caldwell might not be a dead end, that maybe running had brought her somewhere instead of just away from somewhere. Brennan met Ellie on the 4th date. He brought a stuffed bear, got down on one knee so he was at the child's eye level, and introduced himself with the kind of warmth that Darcy had been starving for. "Your mama talks about you all the time. You must be something special." Ellie had smiled, the wide, trusting smile of a 6-year-old who doesn't yet know that kindness can be a strategy. Darcy nearly cried. She moved into the basement apartment on Oak Street 6 weeks later. The apartment was below ground. One entrance, a narrow concrete stairwell leading down to a heavy door with a deadbolt and a peephole. No back exit, no windows large enough for an adult to climb through. Brennan had chosen it for the same reason a trapper chooses a one-entrance cage: control. The man who lived there could see everything coming in and knew that nothing was getting out without his permission. The mask slipped on a Thursday night in their 4th month together. Darcy had come home late from a shift at Harlow's. Brennan was sitting in the dark living room, no television, no lights, just the orange tip of a cigarette moving in the blackness. He didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't raise his voice. He stood up, crossed the room in 3 steps, and hit her across the face with an open palm. The sound was enormous in the small space, a crack that echoed off the concrete walls and hung in the air like a gunshot. Ellie was asleep in the bedroom 12 feet away. Darcy didn't scream. She had been hit before, in another city by another man, in another chapter of a life that kept writing the same story in different handwriting. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She took the blow, tasted blood where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek, and looked at him with eyes that had already begun the process of shutting down, retreating behind a wall that protected what was essential and sacrificed everything else. I don't like waiting, Brennan said. His voice was calm, conversational, as if he'd asked her to pass the salt instead of splitting her face open. Don't make me wait again. That was the beginning. The first slap became a weekly event, then twice a week, then whenever the mood took him, which was often and without pattern, because violence stops needing a reason once the person delivering it realizes there are no consequences. He was methodical at first, punched where the uniform covered, ribs, stomach, back, upper thighs, locations that ached and throbbed, and made every movement a negotiation with pain, but didn't show when she stood behind the counter at Harlow's in her long-sleeve shirt and apron. Then the control eroded. The targets became careless. Her face, her neck, her hands, the places the whole world could see. Brennan stopped caring about visibility because he'd learned something about Caldwell that Darcy already knew. Nobody was going to do anything. The town had made its calculation. Darcy Whitmore was disposable. An outsider attached to a man everybody was afraid of, living in a basement apartment with a child nobody had offered to help. She could bleed in plain sight, and the only response would be averted eyes and the quiet consensus that whatever was happening to her was probably her own fault. 3 months of this, 91 mornings of waking up in pain and going to work and pouring coffee and clearing tables and smiling the smile that wasn't a smile while the people of Caldwell ate their breakfasts and left their tips and pretended that the woman serving them wasn't being dismantled, one beating at a time. Nobody asked, nobody helped, nobody cared, until the bikers came in. What Caldwell didn't know, what Brennan didn't know, what nobody in that diner or that town had any reason to suspect, was that Darcy Whitmore had been building something for 2 months. Not a case exactly. A weapon, assembled in secret piece by piece in the hours between midnight and dawn, while Brennan slept and the apartment was quiet and the only sound was Darcy's breathing and the scratch of a pen on paper. It started with a photograph. Week 6, 4 in the morning, Darcy standing in the bathroom with her shirt pulled up, holding her phone at arm's length, capturing the bruises along her rib cage in the mirror. The timestamp visible in the corner. The injuries unmistakable. She emailed the photograph to an account Brennan didn't know about, an account she'd created on a library computer in Shelton, a town 40 minutes west, where nobody recognized her face. She'd driven there on a Tuesday while Brennan was making deliveries, sat in the back corner of the Shelton Public Library, and built the account using a name that wasn't hers and a password she committed to memory because writing it down was too dangerous. One photograph became 2. 2 became a dozen, each one more deliberate than the last. She learned to shoot from multiple angles. She learned to include objects for scale, a ruler laid alongside the bruise, a quarter placed next to the burn mark. She learned to photograph the room afterward. The overturned chair, the dent in the wall where her head had connected with the plaster. The blood on the kitchen floor that she would clean before Ellie woke up scrubbing on her knees with a sponge and dish soap while her ribs screamed and the clock ticked toward another shift at Harlow's. She began keeping a notebook. Small, spiral-bound, hidden inside a box of tampons under the bathroom sink, a location Brennan would never search because men like Brennan don't touch things like that. In the notebook, she wrote entries in small, precise handwriting, cramming as much information as possible onto each page. October 2nd, 11:40 p.m. Punched left side 3 times. Said if I called police, he would make Ellie watch next time. October 7th, 6 a.m. Kicked ribs while I was getting ready for work. Ellie in the shower didn't hear. October 12th, midnight. Choked until I passed out. Woke up on kitchen floor. Photographed neck bruises at 4:15 a.m. Entry after entry, page after page. A catalog of horror written with the precision of an accountant because Darcy understood something that Brennan never would. Emotion could be dismissed. Facts could not. A woman crying on a witness stand could be doubted by a jury. A woman presenting 63 time-stamped photographs and 41 dated journal entries with corroborating audio recordings could not be ignored by anyone. The recordings were the most dangerous part. Brennan made threats the way other men made small talk, casual, frequent, without apparent awareness that the words coming out of his mouth were confessions. On the night he threatened to kill Ellie, Darcy had her phone in her apron pocket, the recording app running the microphone pressed against the fabric near the pocket's opening. His voice came through clear and devastating. You go, Ellie dies. Simple as that. You tell anyone Ellie dies. You cooperate, she lives. She backed the recording up in 3 locations. The hidden email account. A USB drive taped inside the lining of Ellie's winter coat hanging in the hall closet where Brennan never looked because Brennan didn't think about children's clothing. And a sealed envelope mailed to herself at a P.O. box in the next county, rented with cash under a false name. Darcy Whitmore was not passive. She was not broken. She was not the woman Brennan saw when he looked at her, the flinching, obedient creature he had manufactured through months of calculated violence. That woman was a mask worn for survival, as deliberate and purposeful as the evidence being assembled behind it. Underneath the mask was a woman with a plan, a timeline, and the patience of someone who understood that she would get exactly one chance. And when that chance arrived, the evidence had to be so overwhelming, so meticulously constructed, so impossible to dismiss, that no corrupt sheriff and no skeptical jury could look away from it. What she lacked was force. Darcy weighed less than most of the equipment Brennan kept in his truck. Brennan was 6'1", 220 and violent without hesitation. He had associates who owed him and feared him. He had a sheriff in his pocket. Darcy could fill notebooks and email photographs until the servers ran out of space. But none of it mattered if she couldn't get herself and Ellie out of that basement apartment alive long enough for the evidence to reach someone willing to act on it. She needed muscle. She needed numbers. She needed an army that wasn't afraid of Brennan Collier or Wayne Loomis or anyone else in Caldwell who had decided that one woman's destruction was an acceptable cost of doing nothing. She had a coffee pot and broken fingers and a daughter sleeping 12 feet away. Until October 15th, the Iron Verdict Motorcycle Club had been coming to Harlow's Diner every Tuesday morning for longer than Darcy had worked there. They rode in around 8, a rumble of engines that announced their arrival 2 blocks before they parked. They occupied the large booth near the back, ordered enormous breakfasts, drank coffee by the gallon tipped 30%, and never once caused trouble. 10 of them on a normal Tuesday, sometimes 12, occasionally 8, depending on schedules. They wore leather cuts with a patch on the back showing a gavel wrapped in chains, the club insignia, and they looked exactly like what most people pictured when they heard the word biker. Big men, weathered faces, tattoos crawling up necks and across knuckles, boots that had walked through places most civilians would cross the street to avoid. They occupied space, not aggressively, completely. When the Iron Verdict sat down, the room rearranged itself around them, the way a river rearranges itself around boulders or naturally without negotiation. The regulars at Harlow's had learned to coexist with them through instinct. Keep your distance. Don't stare. And understand that the danger you imagine is mostly projection, because in 4 years of Tuesday breakfasts, the Iron Verdict had never raised a voice, never started a confrontation, never stiffed a check, never been anything other than the most reliable and generous customers Harlow's had. Josiah Kavanaugh sat at the head of the table. They called him Gallows. Not because he'd killed anyone, but because of the tattoo on his right forearm, a gallows with an empty noose, a reminder that every man stands beneath the rope at some point, and the only thing that matters is who reaches up and cuts you down. He was 58 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 290 pounds. A beard that reached his chest, gone mostly gray. Arms sleeved in ink that told stories only other veterans could read. An eagle and anchor on his left shoulder. Dates written across his ribs. Names of men who didn't come home inked around his wrists like a bracelet that could never be removed. Gallows had served in the Gulf War in 1991. An infantry sergeant 25 years old, walking through burning oil fields and learning what human beings were capable of when the rules dissolved. He came home with a Bronze Star, a shrapnel scar across his lower back, and a decade of nightmares that no metal could quiet. The VA offered pills. The pills offered fog. He threw the pills into a river outside Billings and found the Iron Verdict instead, the way a lot of veterans found motorcycle clubs. Looking for brotherhood that civilian life couldn't replicate. Looking for structure and purpose and the particular kind of belonging that happens when you ride beside men who would die for you without being asked and without expecting anything in return. He'd been president of the Montana chapter for 14 years. Under his leadership, the club had evolved from a loose riding group into something with direction. Charity runs for veterans organizations. Security at community events. An informal network of men who responded when someone needed help, and the people who were supposed to provide that help weren't doing their jobs. That Tuesday morning, Gallows walked into Harlow's and saw Darcy for the 91st time. He'd noticed the injuries before. Every Tuesday, fresh damage. He'd asked Merle about it 3 weeks ago, leaning against the kitchen pass-through while waiting for his eggs. What's happening to your waitress? Merle had looked at him with exhausted eyes. Her boyfriend, Brennan Collier. Everybody knows, nobody does a thing. Gallows had stored that information the way he'd stored intelligence in the Gulf. Filed it, assessed it, waited. He'd learned that rushing into a situation without understanding its full dimensions got people hurt. Patience wasn't passivity. Patience was the discipline of choosing the right moment instead of the first one. But this Tuesday was different. Darcy approached their booth with the coffee pot braced against her hip, her left hand dangling useless, her face so destroyed that something shifted in Gallows's chest. A gear engaging, a mechanism activating that turned observation into action. She tried to pour. The pot shook so violently that coffee splashed across the table. She grabbed a napkin, started cleaning, apologizing, her voice a thin wire pulled to the point of snapping. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'll clean this, sorry. Coffee to start, Gallows said. Quiet, controlled. The voice large men use when they're trying not to frighten someone who's already been frightened past endurance. Then louder. Brothers, give me a minute with our server. 9 bikers stood and moved to another booth. No questions, no hesitation. When Gallows asked for space, the space appeared. Darcy stood holding the coffee pot with her one good hand swollen, eye split lip, fractured, hand bruised throat, looking at this enormous man who had just cleared his entire table for her. Her body defaulted to fear. 3 months of conditioning had taught her that men who paid attention to her intended to cause pain, and the larger the man, the larger the pain. Sit down, Gallows said. Not an order, an invitation. The way you'd speak to something fragile that might bolt. She sat, put the coffee pot on the table because she couldn't hold it anymore. Her right hand trembled against the formica. Gallows looked at her, not at the injuries, though he cataloged them with a soldier's practiced eye. The swollen eye was 12 hours old minimum. The split lip had been reopened over a previous wound. The fingers were broken, not sprained, the discoloration too severe for anything less. Neck bruises 2 days old, transitioning from purple to yellow. He looked past the damage, at the woman underneath. The intelligence in her one open eye, the rigid posture of someone holding herself together by will alone. The calluses on her right hand from carrying heavy plates 8 hours a day. The fact that she had showed up for work with injuries that would have put most people in a hospital bed because stopping wasn't an option, because there was a 6-year-old girl depending on her, and mothers don't stop. Who did this to you? 4 words. Spoken softly, without judgment, without the pity she'd seen from Merle, and the occasional customer who held their gaze a half-second too long on her bruises before looking away. This wasn't pity. This was recognition. One person who had survived violence looking at another and saying without words, I know what this is. I know what it costs. And I am not going to look away. Nobody, Darcy started. I fell down the, don't. 1 word. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward. Just remove the lie from the space between them the way you'd remove a stone from a path. I'm not asking again. I'll find out regardless. But I'd rather hear it from you, so I know whether you need protection right now or justice that lasts. Darcy looked at this man, 58 years old, 6'4", 290, hands the size of dinner plates resting on the table with a stillness that communicated more power in their restraint than most men communicated with their fists. She made a decision. Not because she was desperate, although she was. Not because she was broken, although she'd been bent so far she could hear herself cracking. She made it because she had been waiting for this exact moment for 2 months, building toward it, preparing for it, praying for it, in the silent hours between Brennan's snoring and the alarm that pulled her into another day of damage. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out her phone, placed it on the table between them. I need to show you something. She opened the hidden email account, showed him the photographs, dozens of them, her body documented in violence across 8 weeks. Bruises in every shade from fresh crimson to fading yellow. Burns on her forearm, 3 perfect circles. Her back striped with belt marks. Her ribs photographed the morning after he'd kicked her, the skin already turning the deep purple that meant something underneath had cracked. Her split lip captured at 6 different stages of healing, a time-lapse of damage inflicted and re-inflicted on the same square inch of flesh. Then the recordings. Brennan's voice filling the small space between them, calm, precise, describing what he'd do to a 6-year-old girl if her mother stepped out of line. The flatness of his tone was the worst part. Not angry, not out of control, measured. The voice of a man discussing logistics. That's what made it devastating. No jury would hear this and think he'd lost his temper. This was a man who calculated. Then the notebook. Page by page, photographed and uploaded. Dates, times, descriptions. A complete record of systematic destruction compiled by the woman being destroyed. Written between 3 and 5 in the morning, while her abuser slept, each entry a brick in the wall. She was building between herself and the man who believed he'd broken her. Gallows went through the evidence in silence. His face stayed stone. His hands told a different story. They flattened against the table, pressed down, knuckles going white. A man containing something immense. "You did all this yourself," he said when he finished. "I've been building this for 2 months," Darcy said. "Every photograph, every recording, every page. I know exactly what I need to put him in prison. What I don't have is the force to get me and my daughter out alive while the evidence reaches someone who'll act on it. The sheriff is on Brennan's payroll. The town doesn't care. I need people who are willing to stand between me and what happens when Brennan finds out." She held Gallows' gaze with her one good eye, steady, unblinking. This was not a woman begging for rescue. This was a woman presenting a completed strategy and identifying the single missing component required for execution. "But I have conditions. No vigilante justice. Brennan goes through the legal system. Jail trial conviction, not a beating in a parking lot, not a body in a ditch. I need him locked up legally so he stays locked up permanently. And my daughter comes first. Before you confront him, before anything else happens, Ellie has to be out of his reach. She's at Jefferson Elementary until 3. That's our window. But she comes first. Everything else is second." Gallows sat with Orstat. He was a man who evaluated the situations before committing to them, and what he was evaluating now was something he hadn't expected to find at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in a diner in Caldwell, Montana. Not a victim, a tactician, a woman who had done the intelligence work, built the evidence base, identified the operational requirements, and needed a force multiplier to execute a mission she'd been planning since August. "Your conditions are our conditions," he said. "What's the address?" She gave him everything. 1847 Oak Street basement apartment, 1 entrance, narrow stairwell, deadbolt, no rear exit. Brennan's schedule, his habits. When he was home, when he ran deliveries, which days he met with associates, where he kept the drugs and money. Which of his people were loyal and which might fold under pressure. Intelligence gathered over months of living in a cage with the man who'd built it, watching him through the bars, cataloging every pattern, every weakness, every vulnerability that might one day be exploited. Gallows pulled out his phone. He didn't dial immediately. He looked at Darcy first. "What I'm about to do brings hundreds of people into this. Once it starts, it doesn't stop and it doesn't stay quiet. You understand what that means?" Darcy nodded. "I'm counting on it. Big enough that nobody can look away. Big enough that this town has to face what it let happen to me." Gallows dialed. The call lasted 90 seconds. He spoke in codes and shorthand that Darcy didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. Code Black, Iron Verdict, all chapters. Caldwell, Montana. Harlow's Diner. Woman under active threat. Child at risk. Full mobilization. Every brother who can ride here 4 hours. This is the real thing. He hung up, looked at Darcy. "Code Black is our highest alert. Goes out to every chapter in the state and every affiliated club in neighboring states. I've called it once in 14 years. Within hours, you'll have more backup than this town has people." "How many?" "Enough that Brennan Collier and Wayne Loomis and every person in this town who watched you bleed will understand that looking away is no longer an option." The word moved like fire through dry timber. Code Black from the Iron Verdict's Montana chapter. Woman in danger, child threatened. Ride now. In Billings, 14 men dropped everything. A mechanic set down a wrench mid-repair and walked out of his garage without a word to his boss. A retired firefighter kissed his wife, told her he'd be back when it was done, and rolled his bike out of the garage before she could ask done with what. In Great Falls, 22 riders mobilized. In Missoula, 18. Helena sent 11. Butte sent 9. Bozeman, Kalispell, Miles City, Haver, Lewistown. Small towns and mid-sized cities across Montana emptied their iron verdict members onto highways converging on a place most of them had never heard of. The signal jumped state lines. Affiliated clubs relayed the code to their own networks. The Broken Chains out of Sheridan, Wyoming. The Stone Ridge MC from Boise, Idaho. The Pallbearers from Rapid City, South Dakota. Each group that received the code responded identically, without hesitation, without negotiation, without asking what they'd face when they arrived. Code Black meant someone vulnerable needed protection, and protection was the only currency these men dealt in without conditions. Some rode 2 hours, some rode 4. A crew from eastern Idaho rode nearly 6, stopping once for gas and coffee. They drank standing beside their bikes in a truck stop parking lot, engines cooling, checking phones for updates, then mounting up and pushing on through mountain passes, where the October air was cold enough to numb the hands and sharp enough to make the eyes water. They arrived in Caldwell with stiff joints, in empty tanks, in absolute willingness to do whatever was needed for a woman they'd never met. By 9:30, the first wave hit. 15 motorcycles thundering down Main Street, the sound so massive it rattled Harlow's windows and brought every customer to the glass. By 10:30 more. By 10:30, the parking lot was full, and bikes were lining both sides of Main Street for 2 blocks. By 11, the count passed 100 and was climbing. Caldwell had never experienced anything like it. The sound alone was seismic. Hundreds of engines rumbling in unison, a bass frequency that people felt in their chest walls and in their floorboards and in the fillings of their teeth. The sight was something else entirely. A river of chrome and leather flooding a town that didn't know how to process what it was seeing. People came out of shops, stood on sidewalks, pulled their trucks to the curb. The mayor called the sheriff. The sheriff called his 3 deputies. None of them had any explanation for what was happening, which meant none of them had any plan for what to do about it. At 11:15, Darcy walked out of Harlow's front door, stood on the steps, and looked at what she had called into being. Over 200 motorcycles filled the streets, and more arriving every few minutes. Men she'd never met who had ridden for hours because a woman they'd never heard of needed their help. She didn't cry. She had used up a lifetime's allocation of tears in that basement apartment and had none remaining for moments that deserved them. She took a breath, straightened her spine, and walked down the steps to where Gallows was organizing the growing assembly with Forge, his vice president. Before anything else, Darcy said, "Ellie." "Already moving," Gallows said. "4 brothers heading to Jefferson Elementary now. They'll hold position outside." No, Darcy's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of a woman who would not be overruled on matters concerning her child. "I pick her up, nobody else. Strangers on motorcycles will terrify her. I drive there, I walk in, I come out with my daughter. Your men follow at a distance, but I go in alone." Gallows didn't argue. He'd led men in combat and managed club politics for 14 years, and he recognized a non-negotiable position when he heard one. Forge, 4 bikes to shadow her, 2 blocks back. She goes in alone, comes out alone. They make sure nobody interferes. Darcy was walking to her car when her phone buzzes. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words on the screen. "Picking up Ellie early." The ground shifted. Darcy stopped. Read the message again. "Picking up Ellie early." It wasn't from Brennan. He never texted anything that could serve as evidence. This had come through his network, sent by an associate, either forwarded by accident or delivered as a threat. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that someone was heading to Jefferson Elementary to take Darcy's 6-year-old daughter, and Darcy was standing in a parking lot full of motorcycles 11 minutes away. She ran to Gallows, showed him the phone. His face hardened into something that looked carved from granite. "Every bike moves now," he started. "No," Darcy cut him off. 500 bikers descending on an elementary school triggers a lockdown. They seal the building. Nobody gets in, including me. I call the school. Right now, my voice, my authority, my daughter." She was already dialing. Her fractured fingers shrieked with pain as she gripped the phone. She pressed the pain into a compartment that she would deal with later, or never the same compartment where she stored every injury Brennan had ever given her, a space so full it should have collapsed under its own weight, but hadn't because Darcy Whitmore had learned to carry what would crush most people and keep walking. The phone rang twice. 3 times, the front desk answered. "Jefferson Elementary, how can I help you?" "This is Darcy Whitmore, Eloise Whitmore's mother. Someone may be coming to pick up my daughter. I am the only person authorized to release her. Not a relative, not a friend, not anyone. If someone arrives claiming to be here for Ellie, you keep her in the office and you call me immediately. Do you understand? A pause. Miss Whitmore is everything. Do you understand? Her voice was steel-wrapped in controlled terror. Nobody leaves this building with my daughter except me. Confirm that. Confirmed. Eloise stays with us until you arrive personally. We're flagging her file now. I'm on my way. 15 minutes. She hung up, looked at Gallows. Your men behind me. If anyone approaches that school who shouldn't be there, they stop them outside. I handle everything inside. She drove. The Civic weaving through streets she'd come to know over 10 months past the hardware store, in the churches, in the single traffic light past houses full of people who had watched her bleed and chosen their own comfort over her survival. She drove with one working eye and one functional hand, the speedometer climbing past every posted limit, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Fury. Not the helpless kind that comes from being pinned and hit. Not the impotent kind that rises when you wake in pain knowing more pain is coming. This was directed, purposeful, a weapon aimed at a specific target with the precision of someone who had spent 2 months learning exactly where to point it. Someone was trying to take her daughter. That someone was about to fail. She reached Jefferson Elementary in 12 minutes. The school was quiet. No unfamiliar vehicles in the pickup lane. No one near the entrance. Either Brennan's person hadn't arrived yet, or the text had been a warning rather than an announcement of imminent action. Darcy Park walked inside and found Ellie in the front office. She was sitting in a plastic chair with her backpack on her lap, sneakers swinging above the floor because her legs weren't long enough to reach it. She was drawing on scrap paper the receptionist had given her. A house with a triangle roof and 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. Mama, why am I in the office? Did I do something wrong? Darcy knelt. The motion sent a bolt of fire through her cracked ribs, but she knelt anyway because her daughter needed to see her face at eye level, needed to see calm where there was terror, needed to see the world was safe even when it wasn't. She wrapped her good arm around Ellie and held on. Ellie was warm and real and alive. Strawberry shampoo and crayon wax and cafeteria milk, and the particular smell of a child who has been playing hard and thinking harder. For 3 seconds, the world contained nothing but the two of them and the sound of a 6-year-old breathing. We're going on a trip, baby. Just you and me. Right now. What about school? Am I going to miss reading time? School can wait. Mama can't. They returned to Harlow's at 11:52. The streets had filled further. Motorcycles lined every curb for 3 blocks. The count was past 300. The sound was a continuous rumble that vibrated the pavement and rattled store windows and announced to every resident of Caldwell that something unprecedented was happening in their town, and ignoring it was not an option. Darcy carried Ellie inside. Merle stood behind the counter, pale hands pressed flat on the stainless steel. Merle, can you keep Ellie in the kitchen? Don't let anyone in except me. Merle looked at Darcy's face. The swollen eye, the split lip, the ruined hand. She'd seen that face every morning for 91 days and responded with, "Are you okay?" and accepted, "I'm fine," every single time. Because the lie was easier than the truth, and the truth demanded action, and action demanded courage that Merle had not possessed. That failure was on her face now, unmistakable. "Of course," Merle said. "I've got her. You go do what you need to do, and Darcy, I'm sorry. I should have done something a long time ago." Darcy held her gaze. She didn't absolve Merle. She didn't condemn her. There would be time for that conversation, or there wouldn't. "Come on, sweetheart," Merle said, reaching for Ellie's hand. "Help me make biscuits. I need a good helper today." Ellie went willingly. 6 years old, still trusting, still capable of trust because Darcy had absorbed every blow meant for both of them, had taken violence into her own body, so her daughter could remain soft in a world trying to harden them both. That was the thing Brennan never grasped. Every time he hit Darcy, he thought he was breaking her. He was building something. A mother's fury has no ceiling, it only accumulates. Darcy walked outside. The assembly parted for her without being asked. She found Gallows standing in the bed of a pickup truck, addressing the crowd. He stopped when he saw her. Hundreds of eyes followed his gaze. "She's safe," Darcy said. "Now we move." Gallows reached down, helped her up onto the truck bed. She stood there, 5'4", 118 pounds. One eye swollen shut, fingers broken, lips split, bruises ringing her throat. Surrounded by 500 men who had come because she'd asked. She kept it short and clear and steady through an effort of will that cost more than any of them would ever know. "His name is Brennan Collier. 1847 Oak Street basement apartment. He's beaten me for 3 months. He threatened to kill my daughter. I have recordings, photographs, a written log. Everything. He's going to jail today. Not beaten, not disappeared, jailed. Through the system. With evidence so heavy no corrupt sheriff can make it vanish. And everyone in this town who watched it happen and said nothing is going to answer for their silence. That's why you're here. Not to hurt anyone. To make sure the law can't look away anymore. Clear. 500 voices. One word. A sound that rolled across the rooftops of Caldwell like thunder from a storm that had been building for 3 months and was about to break. Clear. Gallows organized the deployment. 20 riders with Darcy to the front door. 50 surrounding 1847 Oak Street. 100 stationed along the routes to the sheriff's office. The remaining 300 spread through Caldwell's streets, visible, undeniable, a statement in chrome and leather that could not be ignored or dismissed or filed under not our business. Forge perimeter at Oak Street. Cinder your documentation. Every photograph, every frame of video. If he blinks, I want it recorded. Everyone else, you know what code black means. We protect, we witness, we do not start violence, but we finish it if someone else does. 500 engines fired. The sound rose through Caldwell like a declaration against every silence the town had ever kept. A bass vibration that traveled through the ground and the air that shook windows and scattered birds and turned heads for miles. People came out of their houses to watch the convoy form on Main Street, a river of chrome and purpose, flowing toward Oak Street, led by a battered Civic driven by the woman they had all watched suffer and all decided to ignore. The procession stretched 6 blocks. It moved slowly, deliberately. Speed wasn't the point, visibility was. Every resident who stepped outside or peered through curtains saw the same thing. A beaten woman leading 500 motorcycles through the streets of their town. The woman whose split lip they had noted and dismissed. The woman who had poured their coffee with fractured fingers while they debated football scores and weather forecasts and everything in the world except the obvious fact that the person serving them was being destroyed. Darcy drove, one working eye, one functional hand, 500 motorcycles at her back. In front of her, the street she'd walked 1,000 times in pain, heading toward the apartment she'd crawled into and crawled out of and crawled through on her hands and knees. The convoy turned onto Oak Street. The sound amplified off the houses, funneled by the narrow residential corridor into something that felt less like motorcycles and more like judgment arriving on a schedule it had set for itself. Curtains moved in every window. The block held its breath. 1847 Oak Street, a 2-story house converted into apartments decades ago. The basement entrance was around the side, a concrete stairwell descending to a door with a deadbolt and a peephole. One way in, one way out. The architecture of control. Darcy parked, got out, stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at the door she'd walked through hundreds of times. The door she'd stumbled through bleeding. The door she'd crawled through at 3 a.m, pressing a bag of frozen peas against her face, listening to Brennan snore. A door that had meant confinement for 3 months and was about to mean something different. Gallows and 20 riders positioned themselves behind her. The rest filled the street, the sidewalks, the yards, the alley behind the house. A perimeter so complete that a bird couldn't have left that building unnoticed. The morning was cold. October in Montana. Darcy's breath clouded. Through the thin basement walls, she heard Brennan's television. A game show. Canned applause and synthetic enthusiasm leaking through concrete while 500 men stood silent above. She descended the stairs, 12 steps. She counted them as she always counted them, a habit from navigating them in the dark with injuries that made balance treacherous. At the bottom, the door, the peephole, a dark circle at eye level. She raised her broken hand and knocked. 3 times, firm, deliberate, each knock sending pain through her shattered fingers that she absorbed without expression, because pain was a language she'd become fluent in, and today she was using it to say something new. The silence after the knocks was the loudest thing she had ever heard. 500 men holding their breath. A town watching from behind curtains. A daughter making biscuits in a diner kitchen a mile away, safe for the first time in 3 months. The lock turned. The door opened. Brennan Collier stood in the doorway in a white undershirt and basketball shorts, barefoot, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand, and found the woman he'd beaten looking back at him without a trace of the fear he'd spent 3 months installing. Behind her, 20 men in leather. Above her, 500 more. In her pocket, every piece of evidence needed to end his freedom. The look on his face was worth every bruise she'd ever received. Brennan Collier stood in the doorway of his basement apartment wearing a white undershirt and basketball shorts, barefoot, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand and a television remote in the other. Behind him, the apartment was dim and cluttered. The blue light of a game show flickered against the walls. Cash sat on the kitchen table in rubber-banded stacks. A digital scale and small plastic bags were visible on the counter beside the stove. The apartment smelled like stale cigarette smoke and the particular staleness of a space that never got enough sunlight. He looked at Darcy first. His eyes did what they always did when he saw her. Assessed, calculated, measured the distance between them and the level of submission on her face. This was reflex for Brennan, the automatic appraisal of a man who maintained control through constant monitoring. But something was wrong with the calculation. Darcy was standing straight. Her shoulders were back. Her one open eye was looking directly into his without the downward flicker he'd trained into her over months of systematic violence. Then he looked past her and saw the men, 20 of them filling the narrow stairwell and the concrete landing above leather cuts, Patch's face that communicated a very specific kind of capability, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Then he heard the sound from the street, 500 motorcycles idling, a low, continuous thunder that vibrated through the building's foundation and into his bare feet. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly, just enough for Darcy to hear. She'd spent months cataloging his tones, the calm one he used before hitting her, the friendly one he used in public, the cold one he used when making threats. She'd never heard this one before. Uncertain, a man encountering something outside his experience of control. Darcy stepped forward. Not Gallows, not Forge, not any of the 20 men behind her. Darcy, half his size, one eye swollen shut, fingers broken by the man standing in front of her. "This is over, Brennan." 3 words, no volume, no drama. The simple declaration of a fact that had already been decided and was now being delivered. Brennan's face cycled through expressions like a slot machine trying to land on the right response. Confusion, anger, fear, more confusion. His eyes kept darting past Darcy to the bikers, trying to count them, trying to assess the threat, trying to figure out what leverage he had. The sandwich was still in his hand. He hadn't put it down, a small detail that told Darcy everything she needed to know. He was frozen. The man who had controlled every aspect of her existence for months was standing in his own doorway, holding a ham sandwich and wearing basketball shorts, and he had absolutely no idea what to do. "I have recordings of you threatening to kill Ellie," Darcy said. "I have photographs of every injury you've given me for the last 2 months. I have a notebook documenting every beating with dates, times, and descriptions. I have copies of everything in 3 separate locations that you'll never find. And I have 500 men standing in the street who came here today because I asked them to." She let that settle, watched his eyes move as the information landed. "You're going to jail. Not tonight, not next week, today, right now. And you're going to go quietly because if you don't, the alternative isn't me. It's them." She tilted her head slightly toward Gallows, who stood 2 steps behind her, with his arms crossed and his face carrying the expression of a man who was exercising restraint as a courtesy, not a limitation. Brennan finally put the sandwich down, set it on the small table beside the door the way someone sets down a weapon they've realized is useless. "You can't do this." "I already did it," Darcy said. 2 months ago when I started recording you, you just didn't know." Brennan's jaw worked. The muscles in his neck tightened. Darcy recognized the signs. She'd seen them hundreds of times, the precursors to violence, the physical tells that preceded a slap, a punch, a chokehold. His body was defaulting to the only response it knew when challenged. Gallows recognized it too. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't change his posture. He simply existed more completely in the space behind Darcy. His presence expanded the way a shadow expands when the light source shifts. Brennan's eyes flicked to him, and whatever he saw there dissolved the impulse before it could reach his hands. Cinder stepped forward with a phone documenting everything. The apartment, the cash on the table, the scale on the counter, the bags, the evidence of a drug operation that had been running under the nose of local law enforcement for years, protected by payments to a sheriff who had decided that money was more important than a woman's safety. "We're going to the sheriff's office," Darcy said. You walk out of here on your own feet, or these men carry you. Your choice. Brennan looked at the 20 men in the stairwell, looked past them to the street where the sound of 500 engines continued to rumble. Looked back at Darcy, at the woman he'd broken fingers on last night, at the woman he'd choked unconscious last week, at the woman who was standing in his doorway with an army behind her and evidence in her pocket and a look in her one open eye that he had never seen before because he had never bothered to imagine that the person he was destroying was capable of destroying him back. I want a lawyer, he said. You'll get one. In jail? Move. Brennan moved. They walked him up the stairs and into the daylight. The effect was immediate and devastating. Brennan Collier, who had moved through Caldwell for years as a man people feared and avoided, emerged from his basement apartment in basketball shorts and an undershirt flanked by 20 bikers to find 500 more filling his street and every street around it. The scale of it was incomprehensible. He'd expected isolation. He'd built his entire operation on the assumption that Darcy was alone, that nobody cared about her, that he could do whatever he wanted because she had no one. He was now looking at the physical refutation of that assumption, and it was wearing leather and blocking every direction he could see. Neighbors were on their porches, watching, some with phones out recording. The convoy that had rolled through Main Street 20 minutes ago had drawn every curious and bored resident within walking distance. They lined the sidewalks. They stood in yards. They sat on truck tailgates. Caldwell hadn't seen a spectacle since the county fair 3 years ago, and this was orders of magnitude beyond any county fair. Forge organized the escort. 10 bikers ahead, 10 behind, Darcy walking beside Brennan close enough that he could see her swollen eye in his peripheral vision with every step. Close enough that the whole town could see them together. The beaten woman and the man who beat her walking through the streets of the community that had allowed it to happen. The walk to the sheriff's office was 6 blocks. Darcy had calculated this. She could have driven. She could have let the bikers transport Brennan in a vehicle. She chose to walk because walking took time, and time meant visibility, and visibility meant that every person in Caldwell who had looked away from her injuries would now have to look directly at the man who caused them. They walked. Brennan in his bare feet on the cold pavement, flinching at every pebble stripped of the truck and the money and the swagger that had insulated him from consequences. Darcy beside him in her work uniform, apron still on Harlow's diner, stitched across the chest, the same uniform she'd worn while serving coffee to people who watched her suffer and did nothing. 500 bikers surrounding them, the sound of boots and engines filling the streets. Main Street cleared for them without being asked. Cars pulled to the curb. Pedestrians moved to the sidewalks. The convoy of motorcycles rolled at walking pace behind the procession, a slow parade of chrome and consequence. Shop owners stood in their doorways. The woman from the hair salon came out with a comb still in her hand. The pharmacist locked his register and walked to the window. The librarian watched from the second-floor stacks with her hand over her mouth. People stared, some openly, some from behind curtains. A few turned away, most didn't. The image was too compelling, too confrontational, too impossible to dismiss. A woman with a destroyed face walking her abuser to jail, while an army of strangers provided the protection her own community had refused. Old men who had fought in wars and built this town stood on porches and watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't indict them. They had seen Darcy Whitmore's face every week for 3 months and done the mental arithmetic that excused their inaction. And now the sum of that arithmetic was walking past them in bare feet and handcuffs. The math had been wrong. They knew it now. Some of them had known it all along. The sheriff's office was a single-story brick building on 2nd Avenue adjacent to the volunteer fire station. It had 2 holding cells, a dispatch desk, an evidence room the size of a closet, and a staff of 4. Sheriff Wayne Loomis, 3 deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who worked Tuesday through Thursday. Loomis was standing in the doorway when they arrived. He'd been warned. His deputies had called him when the first motorcycles appeared. He'd watched the convoy from his office window, made 3 phone calls, and decided on a strategy. Deny, deflect, assert authority. He was a big man, Loomis, 6'2", 240, with a gut that had been growing since he stopped walking his own patrols 5 years ago. He wore the uniform the way bureaucrats wear uniforms. As a costume, not a calling. His badge was polished, his belt was strained, his hand rested on the butt of a sidearm he hadn't fired since qualifying at the range 8 months ago. "What in the hell is going on here?" Loomis said, stepping forward to block the entrance. Darcy stopped 3 feet from him. Brennan stood beside her, surrounded by bikers, silent and diminished. Behind them, the street was filled with motorcycles and the people of Caldwell who had followed the procession to see what would happen next. Sheriff Loomis, Darcy said, "I'm filing charges against Brennan Collier for aggravated assault, multiple counts domestic violence, and criminal threatening. I have photographic evidence, audio recordings, and a written log documenting 3 months of systematic abuse. I'm also reporting evidence of drug distribution found in his residence at 1847 Oak Street, which my witnesses have photographed and documented. I need you to arrest this man." She said it clearly, loudly, in a voice that carried across the crowd. Not for Loomis's benefit, for the town's. Everything that happened from this point forward would happen in front of witnesses. Loomis looked at Brennan. Something passed between them. A communication that happened in the space below language, the silent exchange of men who had an arrangement and were now watching that arrangement collapse in real time. "This is a law enforcement matter," Loomis said carefully. "I'm going to need these civilians to clear out before I can process anything. This is a secure facility and—" "That's not happening," Darcy said. "Excuse me, 500 people are watching, Sheriff. They're not leaving. I'm not leaving. I've been beaten for 3 months in your jurisdiction. You've received reports. Merle at Harlow's told Deputy Coates in August. A customer named Vern Henderson mentioned it to you directly at the Rotary meeting in September. You did nothing. You ignored it. And I think I know why." She looked at Brennan, looked back at Loomis, let the implications sit in the air between them like smoke. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to arrest Brennan Collier. You're going to book him on every charge I've listed. You're going to accept the evidence I'm providing, which includes audio recordings, photographs, and a written log. And you're going to do it right here, right now, in front of the 500 people who came today because your office failed to protect me for 3 months." Loomis's face darkened. The calm, bureaucratic mask he'd been wearing began to slip, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The face of a man whose authority was being challenged in front of his entire town by a woman he'd classified as disposable. "Now you listen to me," he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped low, meant only for Darcy. "You don't come into my jurisdiction and tell me how to run my office. I decide who gets arrested and when. I decide what constitutes evidence. You want to file a complaint, you come back during business hours, fill out the paperwork, and wait for an investigation like everybody else." "It is business hours," Darcy said. She didn't step back. She didn't lower her voice. She matched his volume precisely, which meant the crowd heard everything. "And you've had 3 months to investigate. You chose not to. So now I'm providing the investigation you refused to conduct." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. Opened the recording app. Not the recordings of Brennan, a different recording. Newer. "Sheriff, before you make any more decisions about how to handle this, I want you to hear something." She pressed play. The speaker wasn't loud, but the crowd was silent, and in that silence, the voice that emerged from the phone was unmistakable. Brennan Collier's voice. Calm, casual, the voice of a man discussing routine business with the easy confidence of someone who had never imagined the walls had ears. "Loomis gets $2,000 a month. Been paying him since I set up. He knows everything. The drugs, Darcy, all of it. He looks the other way. That's the arrangement. He breaks it, I have records. Dates, amounts, how I delivered the cash. His wife's car, I paid for that. His kids' braces, I paid for those too. Loomis is mine." The recording played for 19 seconds. In those 19 seconds, Darcy watched the entire architecture of Wayne Loomis's life collapse. His authority, his reputation, his future in law enforcement. His marriage, probably once his wife learned that the car she drove and the orthodontia on their son's teeth had been purchased with drug money. 19 seconds of another man's voice erasing decades of careful, comfortable corruption. Darcy stopped the recording. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. 500 bikers, 200 townspeople, 3 deputies standing behind Loomis with faces that were rapidly rearranging themselves from loyal to terrified. A crowd that had come expecting drama and received instead a demolition. Loomis had gone white, not pale, white. The color of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time in public in front of every person whose respect he needed to maintain the illusion that he was anything other than a drug dealer's employee. "That recording was made 6 weeks ago," Darcy said. Brennan was on the phone with an associate named Dale Craddock. He didn't know I was in the next room. He didn't know I was recording. He never knew because he never thought I was smart enough to threaten him. She looked at Loomis with her one open eye, steady, unblinking. So here's your choice, Sheriff. Arrest Brennan right now in front of everyone, and we move forward through the legal system. Or don't, and I play this recording for the state police who I've already contacted this morning. They have copies, 3 separate agents, along with everything else. Loomis stood very still. His hand had dropped from his sidearm. His deputies had taken a collective step backward, the unconscious retreat of men who recognized that they were standing on the wrong side of something they couldn't afford to be associated with. Darcy waited. She had learned waiting from the master, 3 months of waiting for the right moment, absorbing violence, collecting evidence, enduring what no human being should have to endure, all in preparation for this moment. She could wait another 30 seconds for Wayne Loomis to do the math. He did the math. It took 12 seconds. Deputy Coach Loomis said, his voice stripped of everything except the mechanical function of issuing orders. Arrest Brennan Collier. Aggravated assault, multiple counts, domestic violence, read him his rights, process him by the book. Coates moved forward, handcuffs out. Brennan's wrists were locked behind his back with the efficient, practiced movements of a deputy who was very motivated to appear competent in front of 500 witnesses. You're making a mistake, Brennan said to Loomis. To Darcy, to the world in general, a man still clinging to the belief that threats had currency even as every form of power he'd accumulated was being stripped away in front of his neighbors. The only mistake, Darcy said, was thinking I wouldn't fight back. They booked Brennan Collier at 11 minutes past 1 on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Darcy provided the evidence. All of it. Every photograph, every recording, every page of the notebook. She handed it over in the lobby of the sheriff's office in full view of the 3 deputies, 7 townspeople who had crowded inside, and Cinder, who documented the transfer on video. The drug evidence was processed separately. The cash, the scale, the bags, the photographs of the apartment. Enough to add distribution charges that would compound the assault charges and ensure that Brennan's stay in custody was measured in years, not months. Loomis processed the arrest with the grim efficiency of a man performing a surgery on himself. Every step he took was a step deeper into his own exposure. He knew it. Darcy knew it. The deputies knew it. But the machinery of the law, once engaged, doesn't stop for the comfort of the people operating it. Darcy walked out of the sheriff's office at 2:15. Brennan was in a holding cell. The evidence was logged. The charges were filed. The first phase was complete. Gallows was waiting outside, leaning against his motorcycle with his arms crossed. State Police, Darcy said. I want them here before Loomis has time to make the evidence disappear. Already called, Gallows said. Forge made the call while you were inside. 2 investigators from the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation. They'll be here by evening. Darcy nodded, then we do the rest. The rest was the part that Caldwell would remember long after Brennan's arrest faded from the news cycle. The part that would reshape the town's understanding of itself and what it had allowed to happen inside its borders. 500 bikers spread through Caldwell like a tide. They moved in groups of 10 and 20, organized by Forge and the chapter sergeants at arms, into teams with specific assignments. Each team had a list, names of people who had seen Darcy's injuries and done nothing. Regular customers at Harlow's Diner who had eaten breakfast across from a woman with a black eye and split lip and ordered their eggs without comment. Community leaders who had been informed and chosen in action. Citizens who had witnessed violence in progress, heard screams from the basement apartment, seen Darcy stumbling down Oak Street at odd hours with fresh bruises, and decided that silence was the appropriate response. The visits were not violent. They were not threatening. They were something worse. They were confrontational in the way that truth is confrontational when it arrives at your front door and refuses to leave. Each team carried printed photographs of Darcy's injuries. The same photographs she'd taken in her bathroom at 4 a.m., now enlarged and laminated and held up for people to see in the clear light of an October afternoon. The black eyes in sequence, the burn marks, the belt stripes across her back, the shattered fingers photographed from 3 angles, the bruises around her throat. You eat breakfast at Harlow's, a biker would say, standing on a porch or in a driveway or in the doorway of a business, showing the photographs. You've seen this woman for 3 months. You saw these injuries. What did you do about it? The answers were consistent in their inadequacy. I didn't think it was that bad. I thought she was handling it. It wasn't my place. I figured the sheriff knew. She could have left if she wanted to. I didn't want to get involved. Each answer was met with the same response. The photographs held steady, the eye contact maintained. You saw a woman being destroyed, and you decided it wasn't your problem. That's a choice. Own it. The visits rippled through Caldwell, like concentric waves from a stone dropped in still water. The mayor, Ed Pollard, received a delegation of 20 bikers at his office on Main Street. They showed him the photographs. They informed him that his sheriff had been receiving payments from a drug dealer while ignoring domestic violence. They told him that media crews were already arriving, that the story had gone out on social media an hour ago, that by evening Caldwell's name would be attached to the phrase "town that watched a woman get beaten for 3 months and did nothing." Pollard, a man whose primary political skill was avoiding controversy, looked at the photographs and turned gray. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Your job," Forge said. For the first time, start now. The pastor at First Methodist received a similar visit. He'd known about Darcy. Merle attended his church and had mentioned quietly during a Wednesday prayer circle that the waitress at Harlow's was being hurt by her boyfriend. The pastor had said he'd pray for her. He had not called the police, visited Darcy, offered shelter, contacted a domestic violence hotline, or taken any action beyond adding her to a list of names he mentioned to God on Sunday mornings. "You prayed for her," the biker said. "She needed protection. She needed someone to make a phone call. She needed someone to say, 'This is not acceptable.' You gave her a mention in a prayer. How's that working out?" The pastor didn't have an answer. The photographs in front of him made answers difficult. By late afternoon, Caldwell was a town in the process of being forced to look in a mirror. The bikers had visited over 40 households and businesses. The photographs had been seen by hundreds of people. The conversations had been overheard, repeated, discussed, argued over in kitchens and on sidewalks and in the parking lot of the grocery store. The town split, not evenly. The fault line ran through the center of Caldwell's self-image, separating the people who were willing to accept that they'd failed from the people who needed to believe they hadn't. "This is the bikers' fault," one faction said. "They came in here and caused chaos. Darcy was handling it. This is outsiders stirring up trouble." "This is our fault," the other faction said. "We saw it. We knew. We chose our own comfort over that woman's safety. The bikers just showed us what we already were." The argument would continue for months. But on that October afternoon, with 500 motorcycles still lining the streets and media vans from Billings and Missoula setting up on Main Street, the second faction was louder. At 4:30, a reporter from KTVQ Billings stood in front of Harlow's Diner, framed by a row of parked motorcycles, and delivered the lead story for the evening news. A small Montana town is under national scrutiny tonight after 500 bikers converged to protect a woman who they say was beaten by her boyfriend for 3 months, while the entire community looked the other way. Darcy Whitmore, a 32-year-old mother, was assaulted repeatedly by her partner Brennan Collier in what sources describe as a systematic campaign of domestic violence that was visible to dozens of local residents, business owners, and even law enforcement. None of them intervened. Today, a motorcycle club called the Iron Verdict did what this town wouldn't. They mobilized 500 members from across multiple states, confronted the alleged abuser, and forced his arrest. The local sheriff is now under investigation for potential corruption. This is a story about one woman's courage and an entire community's failure. The story aired at 6. By 7, it was on every Montana news outlet. By 9, it had been picked up nationally. Cable news ran the footage of 500 motorcycles on Main Street alongside the photographs of Darcy's injuries that she'd authorized for release, her battered face next to the image of Brennan being walked barefoot through the streets he'd once controlled. By midnight, Caldwell, Montana was the most searched town name on the internet, and the phrases 500 bikers and town's complicity were trending alongside Darcy Whitmore's name. Comment sections filled with rage. Not at the bikers, at Caldwell, at the customers who ate breakfast while a woman bled, at the sheriff who took bribes while a mother was beaten, at the pastor who prayed instead of acted, at every person in that town who had decided that one woman's suffering was an acceptable cost of their own comfort. The internet was merciless, and Caldwell deserved every word of it. Tourism inquiries, already few for an October in Montana, dropped to 0. Businesses that depended on the annual hunting season began receiving cancellations. The Rotary Club's website was flooded with messages. The church's voicemail filled overnight. Caldwell was learning what happens when a town's private shame becomes the nation's public conversation. Darcy didn't watch the news coverage. She was in a safe house 20 miles outside Caldwell, a cabin owned by a retired Iron Verdict member, set back from a rural road and surrounded by timber. Ellie was asleep in the bedroom, curled around the stuffed bear she'd brought from the apartment on Oak Street, the one Brennan had given her on that fourth date a lifetime ago. Darcy hadn't had the heart to take it away. Children attach meaning to objects without caring about the source, and Ellie needed something familiar in a night full of unfamiliar things. 8 Iron Verdict members maintained a perimeter around the cabin, 4 on the road, 2 at the tree line, 2 at the cabin itself, armed, alert, operating on shifts that would continue 24 hours a day for as long as Darcy needed them. Gallows sat at the kitchen table across from Darcy, 2 mugs of coffee between them, both untouched and cooling. The cabin was quiet except for the wind in the pines and the occasional crackle of a radio from one of the guards outside. State Police are at 5, Gallows said. 2 investigators from DCI. They've taken custody of the evidence copies. They're interviewing Loomis tonight. He's cooperating, which means he's terrified, which means the recording you made did its job. Darcy nodded. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was gone, and what remained was a bone-deep weariness that made her limbs feel like they belonged to someone else. He'll post bail, Darcy said. Not likely. Assault charges, plus the drug charges, plus the threatening evidence. Judge Winslow is hearing the arraignment tomorrow morning. I know Winslow. He doesn't grant bail for violent offenders with drug connections and a demonstrated willingness to threaten witnesses. And if he does, then we're here, around the clock, until the trial, however long that takes. Darcy looked at the bedroom door. Ellie's small shoes were lined up neatly beside it. She always took her shoes off and lined them up, left shoe on the left, right shoe on the right. A habit she'd developed at 4 years old that Darcy had never corrected because it was so perfectly Ellie, so orderly and deliberate in a life that was anything but. She's safe tonight, Darcy said. First time in months I can say that and mean it. She's safe every night from now on, Gallows said. That's the promise, not just tonight. Darcy didn't respond. Promises from men had a specific track record in her experience, and the record wasn't good. But Gallows wasn't offering the kind of promise that came with conditions or expiration dates. He was offering the kind that came with 8 armed men outside and a network of 500 who would ride through the night if she needed them. She chose to believe it, not because she was naive, because she'd earned the right to believe in something, and Gallows had earned the right to be believed. The night passed quietly. Darcy slept for the first time in weeks without the sound of Brennan's breathing in the next room, without the constant calculation of how to position her body to minimize damage if he woke up violent, without the low-grade terror that had become so constant she'd forgotten what its absence felt like. She woke at 6. Habit, 3 months of opening Harlow's Diner at 6 a.m. had rewritten her internal clock. She lay in bed for a moment, disoriented by the silence. No television from the living room. No footsteps, no slamming doors, just pine trees outside the window and the sound of a bird she couldn't identify. Then Ellie climbed into bed beside her, smelling like sleep and laundry soap, and pressed her warm face against Darcy's shoulder. Mama, can we stay here? I like it here. There's trees. We can stay as long as we need to, baby. Good. I like the trees. The arraignment happened at 10. Judge Winslow denied bail, citing flight risk, danger to the victim, and the severity of combined charges. Brennan Collier would remain in county lockup pending trial. His court-appointed attorney filed a protest that was noted and dismissed. Darcy exhaled when Gallows called with the news, a breath she'd been holding since she knocked on Brennan's door the previous morning. He was in a cell. He would stay in a cell. The first wall between her daughter and danger was built. But walls have cracks, and Brennan Collier knew how to find them. It started 4 days after the arrest. A car parked at the end of the road leading to the safe house. Engine idling. Tinted windows. It sat for 20 minutes, then drove away. The Iron Verdict guards noted the plate number, ran it through contacts in law enforcement, and identified the vehicle as belonging to Dale Craddock, the associate Brennan had mentioned in the recording that brought down Sheriff Loomis. Craddock was Brennan's closest remaining connection to the outside world, a runner mid-level handling distribution while Brennan was locked up. He had 2 prior convictions, no violent charges, and the general reputation of a man who did what he was told without asking questions. He'd been told something. The car's appearance at the Safe House Road made that clear. 2 days later, a message arrived. Not a call, not a text, a handwritten note folded into Ellie's backpack at school. Someone had accessed the building during lunch period and placed the note in the front pocket of a 6-year-old girl's backpack. The note said, "Drop the charges, go back to the apartment, or we visit again when the bikers aren't looking." No signature, no name. Block letters on lined paper, the kind of paper you could buy at any gas station. Just the calm, declarative language of a threat designed by a man who still believed he could control from inside a cell what he'd controlled from inside a basement apartment. Darcy found the note at 6 p.m. when she was unpacking Ellie's bag. Her daughter was in the next room watching a cartoon about a storm that solved mysteries, laughing at something the cartoon dog had done. The full-bodied laugh of a child who doesn't yet understand that the world contains men who would use her as a weapon against her own mother. Darcy read the note standing in the kitchen of the safe house, her back against the counter, her damaged hand holding the paper steady through sheer force of will. The fear came first, instantaneous, electrical. A full-body response that started in her stomach and radiated outward, the same fear she'd felt every time Brennan's footsteps approached, the same fear that had kept her silent and compliant for months. It flooded her system with the efficiency of poison, turning her legs soft and her vision narrow and her thoughts into a single repeating word: Ellie, Ellie, Ellie. Then the fear passed. Not because Darcy was fearless, because Darcy had developed a relationship with fear that most people never achieve. She'd lived inside it for so long that she recognized it as a visitor rather than a resident. It arrived, it made its case, and she showed it to the door. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't call gallows, not yet. She sat down at the kitchen table, placed the note flat in front of her, and thought, the way she'd been thinking for months. Strategically, precisely. With the clarity that comes from having survived enough to know that panic is a luxury she couldn't afford. Brennan was communicating through Craddock. Craddock had accessed Ellie's school, which meant the school's security was inadequate, and Craddock knew where Ellie attended. The note was designed to frighten Darcy into compliance. It was also, if handled correctly, evidence. Evidence of witness intimidation, evidence of criminal threatening, evidence that Brennan Collier, even from inside a cell, was directing operations against the woman he'd beaten and the child he'd threatened. Additional charges, additional years, another brick in the wall between Ellie and danger. Darcy picked up the phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Gallows. "Charge him." She read him the note. His silence lasted 4 seconds, which in Gallows's communication style was the equivalent of a lengthy emotional response. "Don't touch the note," he said. "It's evidence. I'm sending Forge now. We're tripling the guard and pulling Ellie from that school tomorrow." The second call was to Agent Delacroix at the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, the lead investigator on the Loomis corruption case, who had given Darcy her direct number 4 days ago, with instructions to call immediately if anything happened. "Agent Delacroix," Darcy said, "Brennan Collier has made contact through an associate. A written threat was placed in my daughter's backpack at school. I have the note. I haven't touched it beyond reading it. I need this documented, and I need it to result in additional charges." Delacroix was at the safe house within 90 minutes. The note was bagged, photographed, and entered into evidence. Darcy provided a full statement. The school was contacted. Security camera footage from the lunch period was subpoenaed. But Darcy wasn't finished. She'd been thinking at that kitchen table, and the plan that had formed was characteristically precise. "I want to set up a meeting with Craddock," she told Delacroix. "Absolutely not," the agent said. "Not a meeting where I'm in danger. A monitored meeting. Recorded. Where Craddock comes to me believing I'm ready to comply and instead provides evidence of his role in witness intimidation on Brennan's behalf." Darcy laid out the specifics. She would contact Craddock through a channel Brennan's associates would recognize, the prepaid phone number Brennan used for distribution calls, which Darcy had memorized months ago. She would tell Craddock she was willing to talk about dropping the charges. She would arrange a meeting at a location wired by DCI. Craddock would come believing he was closing a deal. He would leave in handcuffs. Delacroix studied Darcy the way people had been studying her all week, with the recalibrating expression of someone revising their assumptions in real time. "You've done this kind of thinking before," Delacroix said. "I've had 3 months with nothing to do but think," Darcy said. "While he hit me, I planned. This is what the planning looks like." The operation took 3 days to set up. DCI wired a motel room in Shelton, the same town where Darcy had created her hidden email account months ago. Darcy made the call on a Monday evening. Craddock answered on the second ring. She kept her voice small, frightened. The voice Brennan had trained her to use. The submissive tone that she performed so many times it was as easy as breathing, although now it was a tool rather than a cage. I got the note. I'll drop the charges. I just want this to be over. Can we meet? Craddock agreed. Wednesday, noon. Darcy named the motel. Craddock didn't question it. On Wednesday at 12:15, Dale Craddock sat in a motel room in Shelton, Montana, across a small table from Darcy Whitmore. He was a thin man, nervous with a receding hairline and the restless eyes of someone who spent most of his life checking exits. He'd come expecting a broken woman ready to surrender. He'd brought a prepared statement for her to sign a document withdrawing the charges against Brennan, typed on a laptop, and printed at a FedEx store, the kind of document that had no legal standing, but would serve as proof to Brennan that Craddock had done his job. Darcy played her part, shoulders hunched, voice trembling, eyes down, the posture of submission she'd worn like a uniform for 3 months. She asked questions designed to elicit specifics. Who told you to come here? What exactly does Brennan want? What happens if I don't cooperate? Each question was a door she opened for Craddock to walk through, and he walked through every one of them. Brennan wants the charges dropped. All of them. You go back to the apartment, you tell the court you made it up, and this goes away. That's the deal. He told me to tell you that if you don't do this, there's no safe house far enough. His words, not mine. I'm just delivering the message. Craddock explained in detail that Brennan had instructed him to deliver the note to Ellie's school, that Brennan wanted the charges dropped, that if Darcy didn't cooperate, there would be consequences for her and the girl. He used names. He provided specifics. He incriminated himself and Brennan with the casual thoroughness of a man who genuinely believed he was speaking to a frightened woman with no options. DCI agents entered the room at 12:22. Craddock was arrested for witness intimidation, criminal threatening, and conspiracy. His statement was recorded. His phone was seized. Text messages between Craddock and Brennan's cell routed through a smuggled device confirmed the chain of command. The additional charges against Brennan were filed the following morning. Witness intimidation, criminal threatening through a proxy, conspiracy. Each charge added weight to a case that was already heavy enough to guarantee years in prison, and each charge had been generated because Brennan Collier had made the same mistake he'd been making for months. He'd underestimated Darcy Whitmore. He'd looked at a woman with a swollen eye and a fractured hand and seen a victim. He'd seen submission where there was strategy. He'd seen fear where there was patience. He'd seen weakness where there was the most dangerous thing a person can possess. A plan executed by someone with nothing left to lose and everything in the world to protect. Darcy stood outside the motel in Shelton as DCI agents loaded Craddock into a vehicle. The October wind cut through her jacket. Her splinted hand ached in the cold. She was tired in places that sleep couldn't reach. But Ellie was safe. Brennan was in a cell with new charges stacking on old ones. Craddock was in custody. Loomis was under investigation. The people of Caldwell were being forced to reckon with what they had allowed. 500 bikers had shown the world what one small town had chosen to ignore. And the trial was coming. Darcy looked at her phone, a text from the safe house. Forge had sent it. A photograph. Ellie sitting at the kitchen table drawing with crayons surrounded by 4 Iron Verdict members who were pretending to argue about which color she should use for the sky. Purple, one of them insisted. Sky's purple at sunset. Blue, Ellie said firmly. Regular blue, you're being silly. Darcy smiled. It hurt her split lip. She smiled anyway. She put the phone in her pocket and got in the car. The trial was coming and she had work to do. Brennan's lawyer would try to destroy her on the stand. Her past would be weaponized. Her credibility would be attacked. Every choice she'd ever made would be examined under lights designed to make her look like something she wasn't. She would be ready. She'd been getting ready for 3 months, one beating at a time, one photograph at a time, one recording at a time, one page in a hidden notebook at a time. The woman Brennan Collier thought he'd broken was about to walk into a courtroom and show 12 strangers exactly what she was made of. The trial of Brennan Collier began on the second Monday of December, 7 weeks after his arrest. The venue had been moved from Caldwell to the county courthouse in Helena, 60 miles south, because no jury pool in Caldwell could claim impartiality after 500 motorcycles had rearranged the town's understanding of itself. The courthouse was a stone building from the 1930s, heavy and serious, with columns that looked like they'd been designed to remind people that the law was bigger than any individual who stood before it. Darcy arrived at 7:45, an hour before proceedings began. She wore a navy blue dress she'd bought at a thrift store in Shelton, the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with grease from Harlow's kitchen or blood from Brennan's fists. Her left eye had healed enough to open fully, although a faint yellow shadow remained along the orbital bone, a ghost of the injury that wouldn't completely fade for another month. Her fingers were still splinted, the fractures healing slowly because she hadn't been able to stop using her hands entirely because mothers of 6-year-olds don't get to rest their hands. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench worn smooth by decades of people waiting for their lives to be decided. Gallo sat beside her. He'd traded his leather cut for a dark sport coat that looked borrowed, which it was. Forge had found it in the back of a closet at the chapter house, pressed it with an iron that nobody had used in years, and declared it suitable for court. It was slightly too tight across Gallows' shoulders, which meant it looked like a jacket being worn by a man who didn't belong in jackets, which was accurate. "You don't have to be in the courtroom," Gallows said. "I know. I can have Forge sit behind you instead." Same effect. Jury sees support. Darcy shook her head. "You were the first person who asked me what happened. You should be in the room when I tell 12 strangers the answer." The courtroom filled slowly. Prosecution team on the left, defense on the right. The gallery behind them divided along the same line the town had divided along for weeks. People who believed Darcy. People who believed Brennan's version. Reporters from 6 outlets, notebooks open, pens ready. 2 sketch artists because cameras weren't allowed. Brennan sat at the defense table in a suit that his attorney had arranged clean-shaven haircut, looking like a different species from the man in basketball shorts who'd stood in his doorway holding a sandwich while his world collapsed. His attorney was a woman named Nadine Pruitt, hired from Billings, experienced sharp with a reputation for defending difficult clients, in a strategy that Darcy had anticipated from the moment she learned who Brennan had retained. Pruitt's approach would not be to argue that Brennan was innocent. The evidence was too comprehensive for that. Photographs, recordings, medical documentation, witness statements, the notebook, the Craddock operation. Any attorney who looked at that file and decided to argue innocence was either incompetent or delusional, and Pruitt was neither. Her approach would be to argue that Darcy was unreliable, that the evidence, while extensive, had been collected by a woman with a history of instability and a motive to fabricate, that the narrative of a helpless victim saved by bikers was a construction, not a fact, that Darcy Whitmore was not who she appeared to be. Darcy knew this because she knew her own history, and she knew that history was the weapon Pruitt would use. The prosecution's case took 3 days. Methodical, comprehensive, devastating. The assistant district attorney, a man named Harlan Voss, walked the jury through the evidence in chronological order. Photographs displayed on a screen, each one landing in the quiet courtroom with the weight of something that could not be argued away. The bruises, the burns, the broken fingers photographed from angles that made every juror flinch. The belt marks across Darcy's back that one female juror stared at for so long, the judge had to ask if she needed a break. Then the recordings. Brennan's voice filling the courtroom. "You go, Ellie dies." Simple. The words hung in the air like smoke. Several jurors looked at Brennan. He sat perfectly still, his face performing an expression of calm that his hands betrayed. His fingers were laced together on the table, the knuckles white. The notebook entries were read aloud by Agent Delacroix, who had cataloged them as part of the DCY investigation. Dates, times, descriptions. October 2nd, punched left side 3 times. October 7th, kicked ribs while getting ready for work. October 12th, choked until blacked out. The clinical language made the violence more terrible, not less. There was no drama in the entries, no adjectives, just the facts of what had happened to a woman's body recorded with the precision of someone who understood that emotion would undermine credibility and facts would not. Deputy Coates testified about the arrest, the drug evidence, the scene at the sheriff's office. He was careful to distance himself from Loomis, careful to present himself as a man who had followed orders without knowing about the corruption, careful in the way that people are careful when they're building a narrative that protects them from the consequences of their own inaction. Agent Delacroix testified about the Craddock operation, the note in Ellie's backpack, the motel room, the recording of Craddock confirming Brennan's instructions, the chain of communication from the jail cell to the associate to the school where a 6-year-old girl had a threatening note placed among her crayons and worksheets. The prosecution rested on Wednesday afternoon. The jury had seen 3 days of evidence that told a single unambiguous story. A man had systematically beaten a woman for 3 months, threatened her child, operated a drug business under the protection of a corrupt sheriff, and attempted to intimidate his victim from jail. The facts were not in dispute. They couldn't be, which meant the defense had to dispute something else. Nadine Prewitt stood on Thursday morning with the measured confidence of an attorney who had identified the only viable strategy and was prepared to execute it regardless of how it looked. The defense calls Darcy Whitmore. Darcy walked to the stand. She'd been prepared for this by Voss, who had spent 2 days running her through potential cross-examination scenarios. She knew what was coming. Knowing didn't make it easier. Some things can only be endured, not prepared for, and having your worst moments presented to a room full of strangers was one of them. Prewitt began gently. Background questions. Where Darcy grew up, where she'd lived before Caldwell, her education, her employment history. The questions were designed to establish a timeline, and the timeline was designed to lead somewhere specific. Miss Whitmore, before you moved to Caldwell, you lived in Terre Haute, Indiana. Is that correct? Yes. And in Terre Haute, you were in a relationship with a man named Gavin Phelps. The name landed in Darcy's chest like a stone. She'd known it was coming. She'd told Voss about it during preparation. She'd rehearsed her response. None of that mattered when the name was spoken aloud in a courtroom and 12 strangers turned their attention to her face to see how she'd react. Yes, I was. And Mr. Phelps was charged with domestic assault against you in February of 2021. Yes. And you filed charges against Mr. Phelps and then subsequently withdrew those charges. Is that also correct? Yes. Prewitt let the answer sit. The jury absorbed it. A woman who had filed charges against a previous partner and then withdrew them. The implication was already forming in the space between the facts. A pattern. Instability. A woman who cried wolf. Can you tell the court why you withdrew those charges? Darcy looked at Prewitt, at the jury, at Brennan, who was watching from the defense table with the first expression of confidence she'd seen on his face since the day his door opened to 500 bikers. Because I was afraid, Darcy said. Because Gavin Phelps threatened to kill me if I didn't withdraw them. Because I had no money, no attorney, no support system, and no one who believed me. I withdrew the charges because I was alone and terrified, and I made the decision that I thought would keep me alive. Prewitt nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer that she was about to dismantle. So you have a history of entering relationships with violent men filing charges and then reversing course. Would you say that's accurate? Voss objected. Sustained. Prewitt rephrased. Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you left Terre Haute under circumstances that included significant debt, an eviction, and the loss of custody of your daughter to Child Protective Services for a period of 45 days? The courtroom shifted. Darcy felt it. The subtle recalibration of attention that happens when a sympathetic figure becomes complicated. She'd been the beaten woman with a damaged hand. Now she was a woman with a history, a past that included debt and eviction and 45 days when her daughter had been in someone else's care because the state had determined that Darcy's life was too unstable to guarantee a child's safety. Yes, Darcy said, all of that is true. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She didn't perform shame because shame was Prewitt's tool, not hers. I lost Ellie for 45 days because I was in a hospital recovering from injuries Gavin Phelps inflicted on me. CPS placed her in temporary foster care because I had no family to take her and I was physically unable to care for her. When I recovered, I got her back. I left Terre Haute because staying meant dying. I came to Caldwell because it was far enough away that Gavin wouldn't find me. Everything you've described is the result of domestic violence, not instability. The instability was done to me, not by me. Prewitt pressed forward. She asked about Darcy's finances, about the fact that Darcy had moved into Brennan's apartment after only 6 weeks of dating, about the fact that Darcy had not sought help from domestic violence services in Caldwell or the surrounding area. Darcy answered each question with the same unflinching directness. There are no domestic violence services within 60 miles of Caldwell, she said at one point. I checked. The nearest shelter is in Great Falls, 140 miles away. The nearest hotline is staffed by volunteers who work Tuesday and Thursday between 10 and 2. I would have needed to leave my job, pull Ellie from school, travel 140 miles with no money, no car that Brennan didn't know about, and no guarantee that the shelter had space. And I would have needed to do all of that without Brennan finding out, because if he found out, he'd told me exactly what would happen to Ellie. She paused. So no, I didn't seek help from services. I built my own case instead. Over 2 months in secret while being beaten regularly with broken bones and no medical care. I did what the system should have done. I did it alone. Prewitt changed tactics. She questioned the authenticity of the evidence, suggested that the recordings could have been edited, that the photographs could have been staged, that the notebook could have been written after the fact and backdated. Voss objected to each insinuation was sustained on some and overruled on others. And through it all, Darcy sat on the witness stand and answered with a patience that came from somewhere deeper than preparation. It came from 3 months of enduring things that would break most people and coming out the other side with a clarity that could not be shaken by a lawyer's questions. Miss Whitmore Prewitt said, shifting to what was clearly intended as her final line of attack. You testified that you collected evidence for 2 months while living with my client. Photographs, recordings, a notebook. Is that correct? Yes. And during those 2 months, you continued to live with my client. You cooked meals, shared a bed, maintained the appearance of a normal relationship. You did not attempt to leave, did not contact law enforcement, did not tell anyone what was happening. That's correct. Isn't it possible, Miss Whitmore, that a woman capable of that level of deception over that period of time is also capable of fabricating the very evidence she claims to have collected? The courtroom held its breath. It was a good question. Prewitt had earned her reputation. The logic was clean, the implication devastating. If Darcy was cunning enough to build a secret case, while living with her abuser, wasn't she cunning enough to build a false case? Darcy looked at the jury, 12 people, 7 women, 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 71. They'd been listening for 4 days. They were tired. They were overwhelmed by evidence and testimony and the grinding machinery of a trial that exposed things most people preferred not to think about. They needed her answer to be simple and true. I didn't deceive Brennan, Darcy said. I survived him. There's a difference. Deception is a choice made from a position of power. Survival is what happens when you have no power and you figure out how to keep breathing anyway. I photographed my injuries because they were real. I recorded his threats because they were real. I wrote down what he did to me because it happened. Every night, every week, for 3 months. She held up her left hand. The splints were still visible. The fingers still swollen, still healing, still the wrong shape. He broke these fingers the night before the bikers came in. He stepped on my hand while I was on the kitchen floor. My 6-year-old daughter was in the next room. I photographed them at 4 in the morning before I went to work. I photographed them because they were evidence, not because I'm a deceiver, because I'm a mother who ran out of options and decided that documentation was the only weapon I had. She lowered her hand. Every piece of evidence I collected is real. Every photograph is a real injury on my real body. Every recording is his real voice making real threats. The notebook is a real account of real violence written in real time by a woman who was being destroyed and chose to fight back the only way she could. You can call that deception if you want. I call it survival. Prewitt had no follow-up. The question had been answered in a way that didn't just neutralize the attack. It reframed the entire defense strategy as what it was, an attempt to turn a survivor's strength into evidence of dishonesty. Darcy stepped down from the stand. She was halfway to her seat when it happened. A woman in the gallery stood up, mid-40s brown hair pulled back, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the heated courtroom, as if she'd put it on hours ago and forgotten to take it off. She stood up and said 4 words into the silence of the courtroom. He did it to me too. The judge's gavel came down. Order. Ma'am, you need to. But the woman kept talking. Her name was Colleen Hadley. She'd lived in Caldwell for 8 years. She dated Brennan Collier before Darcy, 3 years before Darcy, and he'd broken her jaw and her collarbone and 2 ribs before she'd managed to leave. She hadn't filed charges. She hadn't told anyone except her sister. She'd moved to the other side of town, avoided Brennan, kept her head down, built a new life on top of the old one, and tried not to think about what was buried underneath. She'd watched the news coverage. She'd seen Darcy's photographs. She'd recognized the injuries because they matched her own. She'd come to the trial intending to sit quietly in the gallery and watch justice happen to the man who'd hurt her. She hadn't planned to stand up. She hadn't planned to say anything. But hearing Prewitt try to make Darcy sound like a liar had broken something open inside her that couldn't be closed again. A second woman stood, younger, late 20s. Her name was Paige Nordquist. She'd been with Brennan briefly only 3 months 4 years ago. He'd beaten her twice before she'd left town, entirely moved to Bozeman, and told herself she was over it. She wasn't over it. She was never going to be over it. She was in the courtroom because her therapist had suggested that witnessing accountability might help with the nightmares. She hadn't planned to speak either. A third woman stood, then a fourth. Both from Caldwell, both with stories that mapped onto Darcy's with the sickening precision of a template. The charming beginning, the escalating control, the first blow, the threats, the isolation, the silence of a community that looked the other way. Four women standing in a courtroom gallery, unsolicited, uncoordinated, each one a chapter in the same book that Brennan Collier had been writing for a decade. Darcy wasn't the first woman he'd destroyed. She was the first one who had refused to stay destroyed. The judge cleared the gallery. The women were removed, but the jury had seen them. The jury had heard Colleen Hadley's voice crack on the words, "He did it to me, too." The jury had watched four women stand up independently, without prompting, without coordination, and identify the man at the defense table as someone who had hurt them. No amount of cross-examination could undo that moment. Prewitt asked for a recess. The judge granted 30 minutes. In the hallway, Darcy sat on the same wooden bench where she'd started the morning. Gallows sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "Did you know," Gallows finally asked, "that there were others?" Darcy shook her head. "I suspected. Men like Brennan don't start with their current partner. They practice. But I didn't know for certain until just now." She looked at her hands, the broken one and the whole one, the one that Brennan had damaged and the one she'd used to build a case that was tearing his life apart. "They stood up because I didn't sit down," she said quietly. "That's how it works. Someone has to go first. Someone has to take the risk, then others find the courage." "You went first," Gallows said. "I went first because I had you behind me. They went first because they saw that it was possible." The trial resumed after the recess. Prewitt made a motion to strike the outburst from the record. The judge sustained the motion, instructing the jury to disregard the statements from the gallery. Both attorneys knew this was a legal formality. No jury instruction in the history of the American legal system had ever successfully erased what 12 people had seen with their own eyes and heard with their own ears. Closing arguments happened on Friday. Voss presented the evidence one final time methodically, without embellishment, letting the photographs and recordings and testimony speak for themselves. He ended with a single sentence. "Brennan Collier beat Darcy Whitmore for 3 months while an entire town watched. The evidence is comprehensive, uncontested, and damning. Your verdict should be the same." Prewitt did her best. She emphasized reasonable doubt. She returned to the theme of Darcy's past, the withdrawn charges in Terre Haute, the CPIS involvement, the pattern she tried to establish. She argued that the biker intervention had created a circus atmosphere that contaminated the investigation. She argued competently and professionally, and none of it mattered because the evidence was a wall, and the four women who had stood up in the gallery were the mortar between every brick. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 11 minutes. They returned with a verdict on Friday evening as the December sun was setting behind the courthouse and the temperature outside was dropping towards single digits. Guilty. All counts. Aggravated assault, multiple counts. Domestic violence, criminal threatening, witness intimidation through a proxy, drug distribution. Brennan Collier sat motionless as the verdicts were read. 12 times the word guilty filled the courtroom. 12 times his attorney made a note on her legal pad. 12 times Darcy breathed. Sentencing came in January. The courtroom was full again, although the composition of the gallery had shifted. Fewer reporters, more women. Women from Caldwell who had come to witness accountability. Women from neighboring towns who had followed the case online. Women who had never met Darcy Whitmore, but recognized something in her story that they carried in their own bodies, their own memories, their own years of silence. The judge, a man named Winslow, who had spent 31 years on the bench and had seen enough to be both weary and precise, reviewed the full scope of evidence. The assault charges, the drug distribution, the witness intimidation through Craddock, the threatening note placed in a child's backpack. The additional victims' statements taken after the trial entered not as evidence for conviction, but as context for sentencing. 4 women's voices added to Darcy's 5 stories that described the same man with the same patterns, the same charm followed by the same violence, the same isolation, the same silence from communities that should have intervened. Judge Winslow handed down 12 years. 4 more than the minimum. The maximum would have been 20. 12 was the number the judge arrived at after weighing the severity of the abuse, the use of a child as leverage, the witness intimidation, the drug charges that compounded everything, and the demonstrated pattern of behavior that extended far beyond a single victim. In his remarks, Winslow said one thing that Darcy would remember for the rest of her life. The defendant's violence was enabled by a community's silence. This court cannot sentence a town, but it can ensure that the individual at the center of that silence faces the full weight of what he has done. 12 years is not enough, but it is what the law allows, and it is what this court imposes. Brennan was led from the courtroom in handcuffs in a jumpsuit the color of traffic cones. He didn't look at Darcy as he passed. She looked at him, watched him until the door closed and his footsteps faded down the corridor and the last trace of his presence in the room dissolved like smoke. She sat in the courtroom for a long time after everyone else had left. Gallows waited in the hallway, giving her the space she needed. The room was empty now. The judge's bench, the jury box, the witness stand where she'd told 12 strangers the worst things that had ever happened to her. The defense table where Brennan had sat and watched his attorney try to turn Darcy's survival into evidence of manipulation. It was over. The trial was over. The sentence was handed down. Brennan Collier would spend 12 years in a cell, and Darcy Whitmore would spend those same 12 years building the life he tried to prevent her from having. She stood up, smoothed the navy dress she'd bought at the thrift store, and walked out of the courtroom. The weeks after the trial moved with the strange, disorienting speed of a life reassembling itself. Brennan was transferred to Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. His appeal was filed and denied. The drug charges alone would have kept him locked up for years. The assault charges made it a certainty. The witness intimidation charges sealed it. Sheriff Loomis was arrested in February on corruption charges. The investigation that Darcy's recording had triggered expanded into a full audit of his office, revealing years of payments from Brennan and at least 2 other drug operations in the county. He resigned before the indictment was formally filed, but resignation didn't prevent prosecution. He was convicted in a separate trial that spring and sentenced to 3 years. His deputies were investigated. Coates was cleared. The other 2 resigned under pressure. Caldwell got a new sheriff. A woman named Dara Briggs, transplanted from a larger department in Billings, hired specifically because she had no connections to the town's old power structure. She arrived in March with a mandate from the county to overhaul domestic violence response protocols and a personal commitment that Darcy's story would never repeat itself in her jurisdiction. Domestic violence reports in Caldwell increased 300% in the first 6 months after Darcy's case. Not because violence increased, because people finally reported it. The bikers' confrontation, the trial, the national media coverage, the shame that hung over the town like weather, all of it had fundamentally altered the calculation that residents made when they witnessed abuse. Silence was no longer the default. The cost of silence had been demonstrated in front of the entire country, and Caldwell had decided it couldn't afford to pay that price again. The 4 women who had stood up in the courtroom filed their own charges. Colleen Hadley's case was the strongest. Medical records from 3 years ago corroborated her broken jaw. Brennan faced additional charges that would extend his sentence if convicted, which he was in a separate proceeding the following year. 8 more months added to the 12. The practice of violence has a way of compounding when the silence that protected it finally breaks. Darcy didn't watch the additional proceedings. She was busy. The safe house cabin had become a more permanent arrangement. The retired Iron Verdict member who owned it offered it to Darcy at a nominal rent that she suspected was being subsidized by the club, although Gallows denied it when she asked. The cabin was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with a wood stove that Ellie was fascinated by, but not allowed to touch. It sat on 4 acres of pine forest with a creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and in the mornings the light came through the trees and columns that looked like something from a church. Ellie started at a new school in January, a small public school 12 miles from the cabin. She made friends with the speed and ease that children possess when they haven't yet learned to be cautious about attachment. A girl named Wren who collected rocks. A boy named Oliver who drew comics during recess. By February, Ellie was coming home with stories about her day that lasted longer than the drive, and Darcy would listen to every word, and the knot in her chest that had been tightening for 3 years would loosen by one more fraction. Darcy found work at a hardware store in the nearest town, running the register and eventually managing inventory. It was quiet work, physical when it needed to be, cerebral when it didn't. She was good at it. Organization was a skill she developed during the months of documenting Brennan's abuse, and it translated seamlessly to tracking stock levels and vendor orders. Her boss was a woman named Gail who asked no questions about Darcy's past and paid her fairly, and told her once during a slow Tuesday afternoon that she'd seen the news coverage and that Darcy was the toughest person she'd ever met. Darcy didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't feel tough. She felt like a woman who'd been dismantled and was putting herself back together one piece at a time, checking each piece for damage before snapping it into place, wondering if the final result would look anything like the original. Spring came. The snow melted. The creek behind the cabin swelled with runoff, and Ellie spent hours throwing sticks into it and watching them race downstream. The Iron Verdict maintained a rotating presence near the cabin, one or two members always within reach. Although by April, the visits had become less about security and more about the kind of companionship that forms between people who have been through something together. They brought groceries sometimes, fixed the porch railing when it came loose, taught Ellie how to identify bird calls, which she memorized with the same precision her mother applied to evidence collection. Gallows came by on Tuesdays, a habit that started because Tuesday was when the Iron Verdict used to eat at Harlow's, and habits forged in diners have a way of persisting even when the context changes. He'd sit at the kitchen table with coffee and whatever Darcy had baked that week, which was increasingly ambitious, as she discovered that baking was a form of control she enjoyed rather than feared. Bread, pies, a disastrous attempt at croissants that Ellie declared the best thing she'd ever eaten, despite their resemblance to deflated footballs. They talked about practical things mostly. Legal updates, the status of Loomis's trial, the Iron Verdict's plans to formalize their intervention model into something other chapters could replicate. Gallows had been thinking about it since October, the idea that what they'd done for Darcy wasn't a one-time event, but a template, a methodology for protecting people that communities had failed. "You did something that night at the diner," Darcy told him one Tuesday in April. The creek was loud outside the window. Ellie was at school. "You asked one question, but you didn't save me, Gallows. You gave me the force I needed to save myself. There's a difference." Gallows considered that. He was a man who considered things before responding, a quality that made him terrible at small talk and excellent at everything else. "Most people would say we saved you," he said. "Most people weren't there for the 2 months before you showed up. When I was taking photographs and hiding notebooks and recording threats, I was saving myself the whole time. I just needed backup." "Then that's what we provide, backup. Not rescue, backup." "That's a program," Darcy said. "That's something you can teach." The idea crystallized over the following weeks into something with a name and a structure. Darcy called it Ellie's Watch, named for the daughter who had been the reason for everything. The reason Darcy endured the beatings. The reason she collected evidence instead of running. The reason she'd called the school with broken fingers and a voice made of steel when someone tried to take her child. Ellie was the center of every decision Darcy had made for 3 years, and naming the program after her was Darcy's way of saying that the protection of children and their mothers was the point. Not revenge, not punishment, protection. The model was simple because it had to be. Darcy had learned from her own experience that complexity was the enemy of action. When a woman is being beaten, she doesn't need a bureaucracy. She needs someone to show up. Ellie's Watch would identify victims in small communities where traditional services were absent or inadequate. It would mobilize rapid response teams composed of trained volunteers and Iron Verdict members to provide immediate protection. It would assist victims in documenting abuse, navigating legal systems, and accessing resources. And it would hold communities accountable for the complicity of silence. Darcy wrote the framework on a legal pad at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd read the threatening note from Craddock, the same table where she'd planned the sting operation, the same table where she'd sat across from Gallows and decided to trust a stranger with her life. She wrote it in the small, precise handwriting she developed during the months of keeping a secret notebook. And when she finished, she had 7 pages that described a program capable of doing for other women what the Iron Verdict had done for her. Gallows brought the framework to the National Iron Verdict leadership at their annual meeting in June. They adopted it unanimously. 12 chapters across 7 states committed to training members in the Ellie's Watch protocol. Darcy would oversee the training, not as a figurehead, as the architect. The first call came in August. A woman in a small town in Wyoming, similar profile, isolated, beaten, Community aware but inactive. An iron verdict chapter responded within hours. 40 bikes, immediate protection, evidence collection, legal advocacy. The woman and her 2 children were in a safe house by nightfall. The second call came in September, then 2 more in October. By the end of the year, Ellie's Watch had intervened in 11 cases across 4 states. 11 women protected, 11 communities confronted, 11 variations on the same story that had started in a basement apartment in Caldwell, Montana, when a man decided that a woman with no connections and no power could be beaten without consequence. He was wrong. Darcy had proven how wrong he was, and now the proof was multiplying. 1 year after the morning she'd served coffee with broken fingers and a biker president had asked her one question, Darcy Whitmore drove back to Caldwell. She hadn't been back since the trial. She hadn't wanted to. The town held memories that were stored in her body as much as her mind. The route from the apartment to the diner that she'd walked with cracked ribs. The parking lot where she'd stood before 500 motorcycles. The sidewalk where she'd walked Brennan to the sheriff's office in bare feet. She parked in front of Harlow's Diner. The building looked the same, brick and glass and a neon sign that had been buzzing since before Darcy was born. The counter where she'd poured coffee. The booth where the iron verdict had sat every Tuesday. The kitchen where Merle had watched Ellie make biscuits while a revolution happened outside. Merle was still there, behind the counter, wiping down the same surfaces she'd been wiping for 15 years. She looked up when Darcy walked in, and her face did something complicated. Relief and guilt, and something that might have been pride, that all layered on top of each other, like the strata of a landscape shaped by forces too large to see from ground level. Darcy, she said. Hey, Merle. They looked at each other across the counter, where so many mornings had begun with, are you okay? And I'm fine, the call and response of a community that had chosen comfort over courage, until courage showed up wearing leather and riding Harleys. I'm sorry, Merle said. Not for the first time. She'd sent a letter after the trial, a long one handwritten that Darcy had read once and kept in a drawer. I'm sorry I didn't do more. I'm sorry I asked if you were okay and then accepted it when you said you were fine. I knew you weren't fine. I knew the whole time. I know you did, Darcy said. Why didn't you hate me for it? Because I understood it. You were afraid, not of Brennan, of disruption, of getting involved, of the mess. I understand that. I lived inside that fear for 3 months. The difference is I didn't have the option of walking away from it. You did, and you took it. I can't hate you for being human, but I needed you to be better, and you weren't, and that cost me. Merle nodded, tears on her face. Darcy didn't have tears. She'd left them somewhere behind her in the basement apartment, or the courthouse, or the motel room in Shelton. She had other things now. A cabin with a creek, a daughter who collected bird calls, a program that had helped 11 women in its first year, a life that she'd built from the wreckage of the one Brennan had tried to destroy. She ordered coffee, black, sat at the counter and drank it slowly, looking out the window at Main Street, at the town that had watched her suffer and was now trying to become the kind of place that wouldn't watch the next time. Gallows arrived at 8. Tuesday morning, habit. He walked into Harlow's in his leather-cut boots on the hardwood floor and sat down at the counter beside Darcy. You came back, he said. I needed to. This is where it started. I wanted to see it without the fear. And it's smaller than I remember. The diner, the town, the whole thing. It felt enormous when I was trapped in it. Now it just looks like a place where something happened that shouldn't have happened, and people are trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's all any place can do after it fails, Gallows said. Try to be better. You told me once that I didn't need 500 people to save me, Darcy said. You said I needed 500 people to stand behind me while I saved myself. I remember. You were right. And that's what Ellie's Watch does. We don't rescue women. We stand behind them while they rescue themselves. We provide the force. They provide the courage. It works because it respects who they are instead of reducing them to what was done to them. Gallows looked at her, the woman he'd first seen, with a swollen eye and shaking hands pouring coffee in a diner where nobody cared. That woman was still in there somewhere, the way the foundation of a building is still present after the structure above it has been rebuilt. But the structure was different now, stronger, more deliberately constructed, built by someone who understood exactly what forces it needed to withstand. Ellie's outside, Darcy said. She wanted to see the diner. She doesn't remember much about being here, but she knows it matters. She knows something happened here that changed things. Gallo stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Ellie was on the sidewalk, 7 years old now, a year older than the girl who'd made biscuits in the kitchen while her mother summoned an army. She was looking at the neon sign with the focused attention of a child studying something important. "Is this where Mama worked?" Ellie asked, looking up at him. "This is where your mama changed the world," Gallo said. Ellie considered that with the seriousness of a child who has learned through experience, she's too young to fully understand that the world sometimes needs changing and that the people who change it don't always look the way you'd expect. She walked inside, sat on the stool next to Darcy, looked around the diner with wide eyes. "It's small, Mama." Darcy laughed. The sound surprised her, genuine, unguarded. The laugh of a woman who had rediscovered the ability to find things funny after a very long time of finding nothing funny at all. "It is small," she said, "but big things happened here." She put her arm around her daughter. The left arm, the one with the hand that Brennan had broken, now healed the fingers slightly crooked where the fractures had set without proper medical attention, permanently altered but fully functional. A hand that had held a coffee pot and a hidden phone and a pen for a secret notebook and the steering wheel of a battered Civic leading 500 motorcycles through the streets of a town that had failed her. A hand that had knocked on a door and opened it onto a new life. Merle brought Ellie a hot chocolate with extra whipped cream without being asked. Ellie declared it perfect. Darcy drank her black coffee and watched the morning light move across the counter of Harlow's diner. The same counter she'd wiped 1,000 times with shaking hands. The same counter she'd leaned against when the pain was too much. And standing straight wasn't possible. The same counter where a man had once asked her one question that changed everything. "Who did this to you?" She'd answered him. And then she'd answered the question for herself in a way that mattered more. She'd decided who she was. Not a victim, not a survivor, although she was that too. An architect. A woman who had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and used it as the blueprint for something that would protect hundreds of women she'd never meet. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Darcy finished her coffee, left money on the counter, took Ellie's hand. They walked out of Harlow's diner into the October morning. 1 year to the day since the coffee pot had shaken in her grip and a biker had seen what an entire town had ignored. The air was cold and clean and smelled like pine and distance and the particular kind of freedom that only people who have been imprisoned can fully appreciate. Gallows watched them go from the diner window, a mother and daughter walking down Main Street in the morning sun. The woman who had taught him that protection wasn't about strength or numbers or 500 motorcycles. It was about standing beside someone and saying, "I see you. I believe you. What do you need?" And then giving it to them.